what does it mean to be a pioneer? This is a difficult question for many of us to answer. We stand on the shoulders of giants. We enjoy the arts, the sciences, the luxuries of modern life because imaginative people were unsatisfied with the status quo. You may take for granted the simple convenience of turning on Netflix and streaming a movie, yet the invention of the film camera, the development of the television, and the advent of the internet each represent a watershed moment in modern history. It's easy to respect the ambition behind these inventions, but it's hard to truly understand what it means to create something with no frame of reference. For example, if I asked you to create a new music genre, where would you begin? You may think of your favorite bands, throwing them in a blender and seeing what happens. Death Grips and Rush? I mean, it's your genre, I guess. But that's not truly new, is it? That's just a combination of existing things. Digging deeper, you may move outside the box, away from the arena of music altogether. You may find motivation in unexpected places. The singing of birds, the rhythmic clacking of train wheels, the humming of a generator. You can learn to appreciate the nodes of inspiration around you each and every day. That's thinking like a pioneer. This doesn't sound very good, but hopefully you get my point. Sometimes tracing back the creation of a new invention, hypothesis, or genre isn't a simple matter of looking it up and getting a date. The spirit of change often visits many people at once. There's a time to appreciate these people collectively, and there's a time to celebrate the individuals themselves. In either case, it's easy to take those contributions for granted. My YouTube channel is concerned with video games, and a lot of those are RPGs. When I talk about HP or MP, leveling up, and experience points, I can safely assume you'll know what I'm talking about. RPGs weren't always at the forefront of gaming culture, but over time they've become ubiquitous. Pieces of the RPG formula have found their way into almost every genre of game, for better or for worse. Whether you're a fan of Japanese RPGs, action RPGs, or Western CRPGs, the lineage of your favorite role-playing game can doubtless be traced back, at least in part, to American universities in the 1970s. Inspired by Dungeons & Dragons, Lord of the Rings, as well as the groundbreaking text-adventure game Colossal Cave Adventure, programming students would find unique ways to combine their hobbies. The result of this was the mainframe RPG. Connecting terminals to massive school computers, such as the University of Illinois Plato system, students were able to communicate with each other, talking about education, programming, and a shared love of tabletop RPGs. Among other things, it was the genesis of the message board, and as shared interests collided, it became the crucible for the role-playing video game. This is D&D. This is Petit 5. This is Dungeon. Any one of these games, all developed around 50 years ago in 1975, could argue for the title of First Computer RPG. These games were, more than anything else, experiments in what was possible. Video arcades were beginning to pop up around America, and home consoles like the Magnavox Odyssey even allowed for some rudimentary games to be enjoyed at home. Very rudimentary. But these mainframe RPGs were something totally different. They hinted at the untapped potential of computers to facilitate not just simple distractions, but adventures. The complexity was unlike anything casual game enjoyers had access to, with streamlined implementations of D&D's rules and randomly generated content providing fresh thrills with each playthrough. All of this predating games like Space Invader and Pac-Man by years. Many ambitious programmers would find inspiration through these mainframe RPGs, iterating with games like Orthanc, Oubliette, and Moria. Thousands of students clamored for the opportunity to try out these legendary games. Over in the United Kingdom, the multi-user dungeon, or MUD, was born at around the same time. The great-grandfather of MMORPGs, MUD allowed multiple players at different terminals to influence the same persistent world in real time. The mid to late 90s represented an era of creation in the RPG sphere. Yet for everything that was going on, it was still localized to universities. Where else could programmers access terminals connected to monstrously large computers? The advent of the personal computer would change the world in myriad ways, and RPGs are no exception. But first, let's go back one more time. On July 4th, 1961, Richard Garriott was born in Cambridge, England. A dual citizen, his parents were American, Oklahoman stock, but lived and resided in Texas. His mother an artist, his father a NASA astronaut, you could say Richard was born into a family of creativity and adventurous spirit. At 16 years old, Richard attended a summer course at the University of Oklahoma, where he'd learn about geometry, statistics, and computer programming. Here he was greeted by some fellow attendees. Responding with his light Texas twang, he said, "Hello." The Oklahomans looked at him, puzzled. People don't say hello around here, we say hey or hi. What are you, British? And so Richard Garriott was given a nickname, British, which eventually evolved into Lord British. At the university in 1977, Richard's new compatriots taught him how to play a hot new tabletop game, Dungeons and Dragons. Richard quickly fell in love with the game. In particular, he enjoyed being the dungeon master, the one who orchestrates the events of the game for the players. Initially, his games were a bit more basic and freeform. He'd rush through character creation so his players could get to the fights, which Richard saw as the good part. However, he began to notice a friend of his, Robert White, taking a far more measured and slow-paced approach to D&D. Inspired by his love of dark fiction, including H.P. Lovecraft, White was more interested in the abstract world-building aspect of D&D, as opposed to the mechanical combat. He was excellent at creating dark, atmospheric worlds for his players to become truly immersed in. They weren't there to simply play a game, they were there to partake in a fantasy world. Richard saw beauty in the power of interactive storytelling, the power of creating worlds. Garriott wasn't as interested in the darker side of storytelling, but he considered himself to be a student of J.R.R. Tolkien, and his characteristic ability to create detailed context around his fictional stories. The Garriott Garage became a haven for nerds, outcasts, or whoever might find themselves interested in leaving behind the mundanities of life for a few hours. As his love of D&D and Tolkien grew, Garriott put pen to paper and created a world of his own. The First Age of Darkness, a story of elves and dwarves, about the Village of Moon and the encroaching menace of Mondane the Dark Wizard, whose rule threatened all of Sosaria. His grammar and spelling admittedly left something to be desired, but the kindling of creativity had most assuredly been lit. While Garriott fell in love with spinning yarns, he found himself increasingly passionate about another hobby, computer programming. Richard had wanted to become an astronaut like his father, but due to a medical issue was unable to pursue that life path. Rather than lamenting what couldn't be, he dedicated his focus to the burgeoning world of computers. One day, his father brought him to a NASA-owned computer lab, a room of towering, heat-emitting, punch card-reading computers. In that room, like moth to flame, Garriott was drawn to the soul-glowing CRT monitor, a terminal on which he could play the great progenitor of interactive fiction, Will Crowther's Adventure, or Colossal Cave Adventure. Garriott was enamored. An entirely text-based game, you would type in simple commands for your character to follow. Hopefully, your command would successfully be parsed. Following that, the game's world and characters would actively change to reflect the player's participation. Primitive, perhaps, but in the late 1970s, Garriott was mesmerized. As time went on, he considered that his love of D&D and his passion for computers could be combined. Little did he know, such combinations were already being experimented with across the country and beyond. Richard's problem was that he was still a full-time high school student and didn't have access to a computer at home. He managed to convince his high school teachers to let him learn the programming language BASIC, this under the pretext that he was fulfilling his school's mandatory foreign language requirement. Very clever. Over the next few months, he'd use his school's teletypes to write increasingly complex programs. It was slow and it was arduous, but he showed great promise and, perhaps more importantly, a stubbornness, a refusal to lie down and fail. He began to write simple games based on his D&D experiences, creatively titled D&D. He started with D&D 1, then D&D 2, and so forth until he'd made it all the way to D&D 28. Richard rarely finished these projects, not due to a loss of interest, but because he learned so much with each successive game that he felt the need to go back and apply those new skills. As any game developer can tell you, the itch to start again but do everything better can be strong indeed. To quote Richard's mother, Helen, Richard was a teenage dreamer with a perfectionist streak. After graduating from high school, Garriott began working at a store called Computerland. Here, he gained access to a piece of hardware that would change his life forever, an Apple II personal computer. Cutting edge and expensive in equal measure, at $1,300 to $2,600 a pop depending on the hardware configuration, it was not a unit you'd find in every household, and there wasn't much reason for consumers to own a computer, not yet anyway. One day at work, Garriott fired up his most recent D&D project on the Apple II. His boss was impressed. "We need to be selling that on the store wall," he said. Selling his software for money hadn't even occurred to Garriott. So, iterating on his most recent D&D program, he created a game which would be called Akalabeth, a misspelling of the word Akalabeth, which is a story from Tolkien's Silmarillion. It's right here where our experience of Richard Garriott's imagination begins. Akalabeth would release in 1979 for Apple II computers. Just $20 for a Ziploc bag containing instructions, artwork by Garriott's mother, as well as a humble floppy disk containing the game itself. The age of the CRPG begins here. The ROM data for the version you're seeing now is based on a 1980 version, since the 79 original is just short of impossible to come by these days. The instruction manual lays the foundation for Akalabeth, which is the name of the game's fantasy setting. King Wolfgang had two sons, one of whom was next in line for the throne, and the other a malevolent and jealous man named Mondain. With his powers of darkness, he created dungeons through which devilish creatures could find their way to the surface of Akalabeth, spreading death and disease in their wake. Men and animals lived in fear, and the dark age of Akalabeth had begun. However, a beacon of hope would arrive. Lord British of the White Light became protector of Akalabeth. What makes Akalabeth incredible isn't how it looks, but what it represents. This is the original Apple II version of the game, and like many Apple II games, it runs quite slowly. There's also no music and only minimalistic sound. For the sake of taking a look at the game, we'll be playing the 1998 Windows release, which is referred to as Ultima 0. It plays almost identically with some small differences. While the manual certainly has you primed to play as Lord British, you actually don't. You play as an adventurer who's helping Lord British. As you start the game, you're prompted to enter a lucky number. This acts as a seed for the game's layout, which is randomly generated. From here, the game rolls your stats as well as your starting gold and asks, "Shalt thou play with these qualities?" Well, I'll be damned, it is a word, sort of. You're allowed to re-roll as many times as you want, so there's no reason to not shoot for the stars unless you're playing some kind of self-imposed challenge run. Next, you're asked if you shalt play a fighter or mage. Fighters are given more options as far as melee weapons, while mages can more easily control the magic amulet item. Finally, you arrive at the adventure shop screen where you're asked which items you shalt buy. The first time you play, you likely won't know what to prioritize, and yet this might be the most important decision you'll make in this entire game. For a 1979 game, there's a surprising level of complexity involved in character creation. It's clear to see how CRPGs benefited from D&D's existence from the beginning. Ideas like classes, stats, and shops to buy things probably wouldn't have been intuitive inclusions without the pre-existing tabletop DNA. Just as Zelda was inspired by Miyamoto's adventures in the Kyoto countryside, Akalabeth was inspired by Garriott's adventures in the garage. At last, you set out on your journey. The first time you play Akalabeth, you may not be aware of what you're looking at. These square collections are towns, where you can visit the store. These singular squares are forests, the lines mountains, both of which are impassable. The important thing to note are the X's, which are dungeons, and this large square, which represents the castle of Lord British. Your only real direction is text in the manual, which states, "To win the game, it is necessary to visit the castle." So, with each new character, the castle will be your first destination. If you can make it there without starving to death, that is. See, there's a survival component to Akalabeth. On top of arms and armor, you're also prompted to buy food in the beginning. Skimp on this and you'll quickly learn a lesson in preparation. With each and every step you take in the overworld, 1 unit of food drains from your supply. it's a good idea to buy maybe 1 or 2 weapons to start with and then just spend the rest of your fortune on food. Since the game's layout is generated from a seed, it's entirely possible and even quite probable that you'll die of starvation before even finding the castle of Lord British. If you happen to find a world layout that just drops you off right next to the castle, it's probably a good idea to remember that lucky number for next time. Once you find Lord British, you'll be asked your name and sent on an adventure with promises of knighthood in your future. The adventure actually just involves you killing a monster, the choice of which is dictated by your wisdom score. Once you're given a target, you'll enter one of the game's many dungeons, all of which are also generated based on your lucky number. As I mentioned, it doesn't really matter which one you pick, all of them will have the same contents, although the arrangements of the dungeon can be better or worse depending on how many traps are on each floor, for instance. Dungeons can be very frustrating to navigate, but I've never experienced any noticeable bugs no matter how many times I've explored them, which itself is pretty damn impressive. While the overworld of Akalabeth is shown from a bird's eye view, the interior of the dungeons is shown from a more immersive first-person perspective. The return key moves you forward, the left and right arrow keys allow you to turn, and the / acts as a convenient, quick turnaround button. It's especially nice if you're playing the original Apple II version of the game where each screen needs to be drawn before you can take any action. Enemies will often emerge from the darkness. Their difficulty depends on how deep into the dungeon you are and on what difficulty you selected. On level 1, you'll mostly face giant rats and skeletons. Yeah, they look a little ridiculous, but consider how Richard Garriott had to implement these graphics. Individual points were set via coordinates, at which point white lines would be drawn between points to create the silhouette of a monster. He had to keep objects and creatures to about 10 line segments, as too many more and the game would slow to an unplayable crawl. Combat is often a simple matter of taking turns, trading blows, and hoping for the best. When attacking, the game will roll for weapon damage, an axe dealing up to 5, a rapier up to 10. Then a bonus modifier is added based on your strength stat. This means that combat, like many things in Akalabeth, is a bit of a luck-based affair. There's no traditional way to heal your character, and the dungeons are full of pitfalls which can take you lower, and lower, and lower, long before you're ready to deal with that challenge. There are some specialized tools that mix combat up a bit. Bows allow you to damage foes from a distance, and enemies with low health will retreat. On top of the perspective itself, this rudimentary enemy AI is quite impressive for its time. Additionally, the magic amulet is a bit of a wildcard item, especially for fighters. The amulet can be used 4 times, and each time it's used as a fighter, the effect is totally random. It might create a ladder up to a higher dungeon floor, it might create a ladder down to a lower dungeon floor. It might instantly kill the enemy in front of you. It might cause critical damage to your own character. If you play as a mage, you can actually control which effect the amulet has, which allows for a bit more strategy. However, there's an alluring bad option available as well. What could it be? I'm bad. I've rescued the president. I want to know. Well, they did mention that it would be bad. Bad will either cut your health in half, turn you into a toad, which permanently flatlines all of your stats, or, if you're very lucky, it'll turn you into a lizard man. Your stats as a lizard man are multiplied by 2.5, and the effect is stackable. So you theoretically could turn into a lizard man 3 or 4 times and just become an indestructible powerhouse. But you never know what effect you're gonna get. And a lizard man still gotta eat. Lord British, progressive as he is, doesn't care if you're a toad or a lizard man, he just wants evil defeated. The game doesn't feature traditional level ups, although your stats can be boosted. Every time you leave a dungeon, you're given extra hit points and gold correlating to the number of enemies you've killed. An effective way of buffing yourself up and making sure you have enough food in the beginning is just heading into a dungeon, killing a bunch of enemies on the first floor, heading back outside, and then repeating. This is also the only way to heal your character, since there aren't any potions or healing spells in Akalabeth. Theoretically, this makes Akalabeth ripe for grinding, since there's no real upper limit to how much health you can have. Whether or not it's worth spending more time than necessary playing Akalabeth, that's going to be down to the individual. Now, the simulated 3D perspective in dungeons is really forward-thinking for its time, but, it looks the way it does. You see it, I don't need to tell you. It's very, very easy to get lost in the wireframes of the game's dungeons. The 1998 release eases the pain slightly by color coding the graphics based on what floor you're on, but that's small comfort. As if the unseeable pitfalls weren't enough, the dungeons are filled with false walls. If you're struggling to find an exit to the floor you're on, you have to turn and face almost every single wall and move forward to see if you can move through it. This is extremely confusing the first few times you're playing the game, and since the manual doesn't mention them, you just kinda have to figure them out on your own. Sometimes you'll have rooms with false walls next to rooms with false walls, meaning even if you're moving forward, it doesn't appear that you are because the frames look exactly the same. To top off the annoyance, there are enemies on later floors like mimics, thieves, and gremlins. Mimics disguise themselves as treasure-filled tofu cubes and attack you when you least expect it. Thieves will steal your gear, leaving you naked and afraid. Gremlins are the worst, and even though Akalabeth is over 40 years old, I still feel like somebody owes me a personal apology for their inclusion. They'll steal half your food supply. If you have 100 food, they'll take 50. If you have 1,000 food, they'll take 500. Even if you've stocked up on more food than you'd ever reasonably need, a few unlucky rolls from the gremlin, and you might not even have enough to make it back to Lord British. Even when you kill these greedy twerps, your food is still gone for good. He ate 1,000 foods right in front of you, and there's not a damn thing you can do about it. The way gremlins are represented via key art in the Ultima games raises questions. Do they select their own hats in a coming-of-age ceremony? Are the hats given to them at birth? Are they born with the hats biologically affixed? If I ripped that hat off, would you die?
It would be extremely painful.
Regardless of how you do it, once you slay your target, you return to Lord British, who says, "Thank you," and sends you to kill another target. This is essentially the game. Receive target, kill target, come back, and repeat. There's actually a surprisingly addictive ebb and flow to the game. It's extremely simple, relatively fast-paced. This makes it easy to fire off a new character and start again, which, since the original version doesn't allow you to save, is what you're intended to do. The 98 version allows you to save your game on the overworld, which makes permadeath avoidable. Some might say this disrupts the intended way to play the game, but I'd say this is one of those by any means necessary type situations. Even being able to save, Akalabeth is a game of tension. After dispatching a Balrog on a lower floor, hey, I told you it was inspired by Lord of the Rings, you'll be nervously trying to make your way back up to the surface, looking for false walls, falling through trapped floors, and watching those food supplies dwindle. There is an immense feeling of relief as you finally reach the pale white interior of floor 1, knowing that all that stands between you and freedom are some rats. Whew! Never thought I'd be so happy to see this purgatory of a world map. Akalabeth may be the first example of a game with an overworld map. Using different shapes and symbols, map navigation is meant to represent a grand journey through forests, valleys, and across mountains. You can picture your hero nervously approaching dungeons, walking through busy marketplaces, and camping overnight. Food is consumed much faster on the world map than in dungeons, conveying that each movement represents a much more significant distance. When playing Akalabeth, you're meant to use your imagination as you would playing D&D. After slaying 6 monsters for Lord British, your character achieves knighthood and Akalabeth is beaten. Although during character creation, you're prompted to choose a difficulty level. If you choose anything other than 10 out of 10, the game tells you to try again on a higher difficulty. Sometimes it's hard to go back and play older games. Games have changed, sensibilities have evolved. Even those of us who grew up playing more complex or bewildering games might catch ourselves falling for the allure of modern conveniences. With this in mind, it's remarkable how well Akalabeth holds up. It's fairly easy to understand, the visuals are clearly communicated to the player, and interactions are a simple affair. It's easy to get into a rhythm and find yourself strangely compelled by the game, despite its obvious shortcomings. The balance is non-existent, with the game unfairly whooping your ass or breaking in half over your knee depending on how shrewd you play. Yet with the CRPG genre barely out of its gestative phase, Akalabeth's World of Darkness also represented one of boundless potential. Garriott's expectations for Akalabeth were tempered, so tempered that he included his address and phone number after the game was completed, asking players to personally call him and let him know that they finished his game. The game sold about 12 copies at Computerland. At $20 a piece, it gave Garriott some pocket change, the first financial fruits of his labor. Akalabeth wasn't the first commercial CRPG, being narrowly edged out by automated simulations' Temple of Apshai, but it was damn close, being released at nearly the same time. Though Apshai certainly outshone Akalabeth in terms of sheer complexity, Garriott was but a teenager, a one-man army with no development team behind him, and his life was about to change. One of the scant few copies of Akalabeth in circulation found its way into the offices of the California Pacific Computer Company. It's a good thing Garriott put his name and number in the game, because California Pacific contacted him shortly after the game's release. Garriott was familiar with the company. They'd published games by one of his programming role models, Bill Budge. It was an unexpected call, to say the least. "We need you to come out to California. We want to publish Akalabeth." Like a whirlwind, reservations were made, a DeLorean was sent to pick Richard up, and within a day, he was on a plane to California. Richard Garriott wandered into the office, a clueless teenager with no real expectations, and left as Lord British, a pseudonym he'd now formally adopt. Akalabeth, now published by CPCC, would go on to sell 30,000 copies. Garriott earned $150,000 from this venture, over $600,000 adjusting for today. For the 18-year-old Lord British, it didn't feel real. I mean, how could it? How could he be making significantly more money than his astronaut father by doing something he'd be doing for fun anyway? But it was real. He bought a new house, he bought a new car, he turned into a bit of an egocentric asshole for a while, but he course-corrected. It was around this time that Garriott became interested in the Society for Creative Anachronism. It was and still is a group devoted to keeping the spirit of medieval culture alive through study and historical reenactment. He joined and met a few, fellow nerds passionate about fencing, archery, and period-appropriate loot jams. They'd all taken on different names and adopted personas cogent with the period. Garriott became friends with many of these folks. The culture surrounding the SCA was adjacent to Garriott's own fictional worlds. The bonds he forged would help him go on to create colorful and eccentric casts of characters in his future games. More than anything else, his time with the SCA helped reinforce his love of interactive fiction. Whether through role-playing, D&D, his Halloween haunts, which would go on to become the stuff of legend in Austin, or video games. He realized the power inherent in gaming to not just provide passing amusement or to tell linear stories, but to convey lasting, meaningful experiences that would stay with the player long after the Apple II had been shut down. It seemed to Garriott and his parents that life as a game developer probably wouldn't be sustainable. He decided he'd make video games until he couldn't anymore, and then he'd find a real job. However, he was no longer a naive kid with no experience. Now, Lord British was a game developer, a name that many RPG fans would recognize. With recognition came expectation, so he immediately got to work on his next game, tentatively called Ultimatum. That is, until he realized the game's title had been trademarked, thus it was shortened to Ultima. From the development of Akalabeth in 1979 to the start of his work on Ultima in 1980, the technology he had at his disposal evolved significantly. Ultima's development lasted 9 months, which was nearly unheard of in the video game arena of quick turnarounds. Richard's vision for Ultima would be far more extravagant than Akalabeth, with characters, quests, towns, and stories being visually represented rather than relying on the player's imagination. In order to create tiles to populate Ultima's world, Richard, as well as his friend and fellow programmer Ken Arnold, drew individual 14x16 tiles on large sheets of paper. At that point, they were translated into binary code, then hexadecimal code. Finally, the game would be compiled, and they would check to see if everything was drawn correctly. It was a laborious process, to say the least, but the results speak for themselves. Well, at least they did back in 1981. It might not look all that impressive nowadays, but Ultima was likely the first commercial game to have a full-color world map with no blank spaces. This was largely thanks to Arnold's contribution, being a more seasoned programmer than Garriott. Arnold opted to use the more extensive assembly language, while Garriott stuck with his tried-and-true BASIC. While this combination got the job done, it wasn't optimal. The resulting game could only be played on Apple II computers loaded with 64 kilobytes of RAM, which at the time was significant. The average Apple II was sold with 4 kilobytes of RAM. The required upgrade would have cost over $1,000, so only true enthusiasts would have been able to play Ultima at launch. This was somewhat rectified over the years as Ultima underwent numerous ports and re-releases. Even on the Apple II itself, the game was entirely rewritten in 1986 using assembly. This allowed for sound effects, graphical upgrades, and improved gameplay. This version has some very interesting sound design. It's just a bat for crying out loud. Couldn't they have picked something less terrifying? Well, it's not entirely relevant. It's worth mentioning the FM Towns Marty port. This was a CD-based console released exclusively in Japan. Many years following Ultima's launch in 1990, the first 3 Ultima games were remade for the FM Towns Marty. The graphics are absolutely stellar, and the music is awesome. I do call into question some of these sound effects, though. All in all, this version is such a significant step up that it doesn't really even resemble the original game. As such, I'm going to be playing the 1987 IBM PC port available from GOG. The cover of Ultima, designed by artist Denis Loubet, depicts a knight on horseback facing down a metallic dragon. It foreshadows the mix of traditional fantasy trappings with the unorthodox adventures to come. The instruction manual is filled with flowery language and plenty of illustrations, which helps immerse you in the game's world. Akalabeth didn't have much dialogue, but Garriott's sense of humor shone through. His characteristic pomp and circumstance really becomes noticeable in Ultima, with its increased emphasis on storytelling. The whole manual is a joy to read through. I really do miss these big box PC games full of reading material and fun little goodies. Incidentally, we owe that tradition in large part to Garriott as well, although that's a story for another time. This time, rather than simply being the right hand of Lord British, Ultima's manual makes it clear that you are now the hero Sosaria needs. Although Ultima wasn't necessarily meant to connect with Akalabeth, the latter has been retroactively referred to as Ultima Zero, not unlike the Hobbit's relationship with the Lord of the Rings trilogy that Garriott cherished so much. Pestilence and chaos sweep the land of Sosaria, thanks to the black heart of Mondane the Wizard. Sanctuary is nowhere to be found, and kings bicker amongst themselves, all but one, the noble Lord British. Can you help Lord British unite the lands of Sosaria? Can you destroy Lord Mondane and vanquish the evil plaguing these lands once and for all? Adventure awaits. Rather than having the game generate your stats for you, Ultima allows you to build your character from the very beginning. There's a typical assortment of stats here, although you wouldn't necessarily know what each one does, even with the help of the manual. You're prompted to choose not only a class, but also a race: human, elf, dwarf, or hobbit, at least in the original releases of the game. They were renamed to bobbits in later releases. With great sales comes great copyright infringement. The list of classes has also been expanded to include cleric and thief on top of the customary fighter and wizard. There's a lot more going on here because Garriott felt the pressure. No longer making games for himself and his friends, he was an employee beholden to a far more critical audience. One final thing worth mentioning before jumping into the game proper is the tagline in the main menu. From darkest dungeons to deepest space? Doesn't that strike you as an odd slogan for a game that appears to be medieval fantasy? After you select your character and let the game load, you're dropped into a field with nothing by way of direction. The world immediately feels more vast, expansive, and tangible than the empty void that was Akalabeth. Forests, rivers, and castles are depicted with clarity rather than in the abstract. Castles as well as the towns surrounding them are fully explorable. The game presents itself not as a novel diversion, but a bespoke world of adventure. There are several modes of play in Ultima. The first is that of the overworld map. Like Akalabeth, you wander around from a bird's eye view, your food supply slowly dwindling. Thankfully, the food itself has been rebalanced to be a little less punishing. In the overworld screen, enemies will spawn, and getting too close will initiate combat, although you can run away, brave Sir Robin. Next, you have towns and castles. In Akalabeth, locations were represented with text and transaction screens. Ultima features graphical depictions of cities and their denizens. Everybody is shrunk down to give a greater sense of scale. That little guy there is you. Shops of all kinds are given signs so you can easily tell where to go, and Look, there's even recreational areas, like the pond with 5 trees, conveniently located outside the pub so you can get hammered on warm beer after a long day of toiling in the fields and then trip and drown. Towns themselves don't offer much by way of unique content, but each one has a different layout depending on where you are. There are also certain stores and items that are only sold in particular towns. No matter which one you're in, you're bound to find Iolo the Bard strumming his lute and filling you with determination. Oh yo, he hum. Finally, there is, of course, dungeons. The entirety of Akalabeth's code runs within Ultima's dungeons as a subroutine. It's a work smarter, not harder moment. Well, actually, that's not fair. They worked smart and they worked hard. Dungeons are located on the overworld map, signified by caves. While the locations of dungeons never change, the dungeon layouts, once again, are generated based on a seed, this time corresponding to your character's name. The layouts are less compact and maze-like and more elongated, with hallways and doors throughout. This means that enemies can more easily get the drop on you if you're not constantly watching your back. Doubly true since enemies now spawn in while you're on the same floor. While Akalabeth's interactions were usually a simple matter of walking over items and pressing one button, the control scheme is far more complex in Ultima. Now, almost every unique action has a key press associated with it. The A key attacks, K climbs up ladders, R readies different equipment, U attempts to pick locks, and so on and so forth. The unique keys make each action feel distinct and certainly help Ultima feel more like a simulation, although it's a little unwieldy. Having E enter a town and B enter a vehicle, for example, is kind of unnecessary. In dungeons, you'll be engaging in a lot of combat, which is still very simple but has some added complexity. You'll be attacked from unseen angles, so much of your time will be spent turning your character and trying to find your adversary. The equipment in Akalabeth simply had you buying weapons and choosing which ones to hit the enemies with on your turn. In Ultima, you've got both weapons and armor, and they have to be equipped manually in order to be used. You better remember to equip and unequip as necessary. Thieves can steal your unequipped gear, and gelatinous cubes can dissolve whatever you have equipped. Damn you, Xantar, not since Slayer on the 3DO have I seen a gelatinous cube of such pusillanimity. The fighter class has boosted strength stats. The wizard class unlocks a more robust selection of spells to buy from the spell store. This includes the ability to destroy these laser barriers, which frequently bar your progress in dungeons. Any class can cast spells though. This includes ladder down and ladder up spells, which are a nice way of circumventing obstacles. Clerics are spell users as well, but have a much higher chance of successfully casting them. They also have a spell called Prayer, which is kind of like the magic amulet from Akalabeth. It produces a random effect depending on the situation you're in. The Thief class has a much easier time of opening locked chests and stealing items from stores. This is also something anyone can do, but failing will call upon the wrath of the guards. Fellas, please, this is all a big misunderstanding. Diplomacy is not a viable path in Ultima. Mercifully, the game will resurrect you with a fraction of your HP and most of your gold gone, but it's still worth saving your game often so you can reload to avoid that. The systems of Ultima are an ambitious step up in terms of both quality and quantity from its predecessor. The world's layout is set in stone, yet more than ever, you're encouraged to have the adventure you want to have. To start over, choosing a different race and class, and seeing how things can change from playthrough to playthrough. The world of Caesarea is made up of different continents and islands. There's the lands of Lord British, the lands of the feudal lords, the lands of danger and despair, very affordable real estate here, and the lands of the dark unknown. Initially, you're landlocked to the lands of Lord British. With a rumbling belly and nary a penny to your name, you grovel at the feet of Lord British, begging for an opportunity to prove your worth.
Please, your omnipotence, have mercy!
When speaking to any of Caesarea's kings, you'll have two options. Offer your gold in exchange for more hit points, or offer your service, which is in effect the game's quest system. Often you'll be asked to go find a specific landmark, usually located on an island. This requires you to buy a boat from the transportation shop, or, if you're loaded, an air car which allows you to move over land and sea. This is the third weirdest vehicle in Ultima, if you can believe that. There's something hilarious about all these enemies standing on the shore, seething with anger as you cruise by in your air car. Get back here, you son of a bitch! Later, losers. After buying a ship or hover car, the game begins to feel like a real adventure. It's not like Final Fantasy where you're given a boat or airship at predetermined points. You are in charge of everything. You have to gather the finances to purchase a vehicle. You aren't told where to go or what to do aside from occasional vague hints. The level of agency you're given from the moment the game starts was not common for games around this time. I can't stress that enough. Scraping together enough dough to buy some weapons, grinding through dungeons to afford vehicles, and completing quests for kings. The game has an almost rags to riches progression early on that makes you feel proud of your accomplishments. Be careful though, being a pimp with a hover car, you may feel bulletproof, but you'll find all manner of pirates and sea monsters trying to wreck your ride. Engaging in combat on the overworld works much the same way it does in a dungeon, but just from a different perspective. Ranged weapons, for example, can be used to hit enemies several tiles away in either case. If you're not careful, enemies can gang up on you and shred you pretty quickly. However mechanically similar they are, having these two visually distinct styles of combat was an impressive feat, even if the combat itself isn't the most engaging. Finding the quest landmarks will usually give you a permanent stat boost. This, combined with the bonus hit points you earn from dungeons, is Ultima's version of leveling up. When you return to the king with news of your triumph, he'll also give you a stat boost. These quests can be repeated ad infinitum to give you some ridiculously high stats. Talk to a king, cruise to a landmark, then come back. There's one landmark called the Pillars of the Argonauts that gives you a new weapon every time you visit. First you get a dagger, then a sword, a few more visits, and you get a blaster. So in case it's not obvious between the hovercrafts and the blasters, Ultima's fantasy world, even in its simplicity, is not conventional. It's silly, self-referential, and generally just all over the place. It's not tongue-in-cheek per se, there's still a sincerity that breaks through it all, but the game feels very light and fun. It's not often you can speak Old English to somebody one second and then vaporize them with a ray gun the next. While the game is clearly designed with meandering in mind, there is something of a main story to follow. Some of the many kings you'll meet will send you to slay a particular creature, similar to the quests in Akalabeth. Oh, I just knew he was going to ask me to find one of these. Thanks to the ladder up and ladder down spells, dungeons are much less of a chore. Just make sure you take your armor off before hitting level 3 or Xantar will see to it that your return trip is made naked. Rather than offering a stat boost, these kings will give you a colored gem. If you keep your ears open at the local pub, you'll hear tell of an evil gem created by Mondain to keep him immortal. The only way to destroy the gem is to prevent it from ever having existed in the first place. Using a time machine. Powering said time machine requires the 4 gems from 4 different kings, which is the main quest, more or less. You know, I'd go back in time to kill Mondain, but I'm afraid I'd fall under the spell of his beautiful eyes. In addition to various time machine related musings, one king will offer a particularly toothsome piece of advice. The princess will help a space ace through time. What did he mean by this? Well, using the Socratic method, we deduce that our character must go to the transport shop and buy a space shuttle, which is only about 300% more expensive than a raft. If a princess is going to help us through time, and a princess only gives a space ace the time of day, well, when in Caesarea? That's right, Ultima takes us not just to the 4 corners of Caesarea, but to outer space. Here you can find space stations with a convenient selection of crafts for you to choose from. Docking the space shuttle requires a level of precision heretofore unseen in Ultima. The game's movement is largely grid-based, snapping you from one place to another. In space, movement is actually pixel precise, and it's a little tough to get used to. Pressing up on the arrow key will increase your acceleration, while down eases up, stops, and reverses you. I'll take tank controls over shuttle controls any day. While in space, you can scan your surroundings for a map. Each one of these symbols represents one screen. The crosses are space stations where you can trade money for fuel, and the letter H, which I guess is supposed to be like a TIE fighter, those represent enemies. In order to become a space ace, you have to take down 20 enemy ships. So point your craft in the direction of an enemy, change to the cockpit view, and enter hyperspace to change screens. It's actually a really cool effect. The stars change their origin point depending on where your cursor is, which results in some pretty convincing pseudo 3D visuals. Ships will appear on these screens and fire lasers at you. You have to slowly move your cursor, very slowly, over top of a precise point on their craft and fire your laser to destroy them. They'll often disappear before you get a chance, so there's a lot of repetition involved at this point, and don't forget to refuel your ship. In any case, with enough time and determination, you'll receive that sweet, sweet message: thou hast achieved the rank of Space Ace. From here you return to Sosaria, but there's still a matter of the princess. Who is this princess? Where is she? What does she have to do with the time machine? In each of Sosaria's 8 castles is a princess locked in a dungeon. Guino, the jester, who's omnipresent across the game's castles, dances around like a jackass singing, "I've got the key!" You must murder Guino, take the key, and free the princess. Well, sometimes. For some reason, the key only works occasionally, so if you got the wrong one, you've got to leave the screen, come back, and then try again. There we go, onward to freedom. The only problem is the guards and king aren't too happy about the prison break, so now you've got to escape with the princess in tow, slaughtering all the guards in your path. Why is this happening? Why did the king lock the princess up? Why was Guino entrusted with the key? I've got so many questions, but alas, the answers all boil down to that unsatisfying adage: use your imagination. Once you reach the castle exit with the princess, she'll tell you the location of the time machine. Provided you have all of the gems, it's time to confront Mondaine. Our journey takes us to Mondaine's lair, 1,000 years into the past. We really should have dialed in 1,001 years ago, since it looks like he just finished making the Gem of Immortality. Shucks. The battle with Mondaine is frustrating and hilarious. You spend the better part of the fight chasing him down as he turns into a bat and manages to slip out of your grasp like he's covered in Crisco. After seemingly felling him, he'll rise again thanks to the power of the gem. Once you destroy the gem and slay him one final time, victory is yours, and Sosaria is saved. 1,000 years go by in the blink of an eye, and our character finds themselves proclaimed a hero by Lord British. Ultima was a triumph. It, along with some fierce competitors like Wizardry, were standard bearers for a new age of computer games. According to RPG historian Matthew Barton, 1981 was the first year in what he refers to as the Silver Age of CRPGs, a time when personal computers were becoming more common, a time when enterprising young developers were beginning to scratch the surface of the home computer's capabilities, a time when CRPGs were becoming appealing time investments alongside D&D rather than half-assed replacements for it. More than anything, this age represented a promise of quality and ambition for the burgeoning RPG player base. That was no more apparent than with Garriott and Arnold's work on Ultima. The game is impressive, not just for its size, scope, complexity, or what it meant for the industry, but for its sheer variety. The way it threads the needle between navigation, simulation, combat, and exploration is just astounding for its time. Even segments such as freeing the princess, or how about the entire Space Ace saga? It's a game within a game, and despite the absurdity of Garriott's interests colliding in this way, it somehow feels like a cohesive whole. Whether or not you should play it, or if it stands the test of time, these are tougher questions to answer, but there's no denying its place in video game history. The California Pacific Computer Company considered Ultima quite a success when it launched. Reviews were great, and sales matched that positivity. The now 21-year-old Richard Garriott was on top of the world, and at the forefront of this new movement. There were no strict guidelines, no rules on how to make RPGs. There was just the pioneers figuring it out, and the depths of their imaginations. It seemed like the sky was the limit for Lord British. Behind the scenes, though, things weren't going so well for California Pacific. The company's owner had developed a serious drug habit. Employees weren't being paid, including Garriott, who was owed a small fortune in royalties. After unsuccessfully trying to buy Garriott's loyalty with the company DeLorean, he and the publisher parted ways. It was hardly bittersweet. Garriott at this point had made something of a name for himself, and it truly seemed as though he could make video games for a living. He met with several interested parties, including a man named Trip Hawkins, who'd recently started up a small company called Electronic Arts, yet no agreements could be made. Garriott, who'd only been getting $5 from each $40 copy of Ultima sold, wanted a bigger slice of the pie. He didn't want his games sold in Ziploc bags. He wanted packaging with panache and craftsmanship, something that identified his games as portals to another world. Perhaps most contentiously, he wanted absolute creative freedom to make Ultima's sequel. In the rank and file of the early 80s video game industry, that was a tall order. Around this time, Garriott made the acquaintance of Ken and Roberta Williams, founders of Sierra Online. The developer-publisher was making a name for itself, and its founding couple were not discreet about their success. Meeting at their $1 million cabin and employee dormitory, the Williamses and Garriott came to an agreement. Sierra would fund Ultima's sequel. Garriott would have the freedom to make the game that he wanted to make, how he wanted to make it. Sierra, however, would have the legal rights to the Ultima name, including the right to re-release the game. They shook on it, and the next chapter in the story of Ultima would begin. Thanks for watching episode 1 of the Ultima Retrospective. I tried to do something a little more quote-unquote real than usual with this, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing where it goes. There will be other types of videos interspersed between these Ultima videos, so this will still be a variety channel, so to speak, but at any rate, I hope you enjoyed it. I'd like to thank my patrons for funding this channel. I've been reinvesting a lot of this money into things that make the videos better. If you're interested in helping the channel out in exchange for all kinds of bonuses, including exclusive reviews, please consider clicking the Patreon link in the description. Low as the price of coffee a month gets you access to hours and hours of content. I'd like to especially thank those in my Persons of Lordly Caliber Patreon tier. Alright, take 3 of me trying to read everybody in my Persons of Lordly Caliber in one breath. Adam Safranco, Matthew Sean Dick, Banana Turnip, Sleepy, Avil and Hime Takamura, True Manalist, Spencer Kennelly, Simone Bunn, John Turcott, Captain, BB Squirrel, Shane Shack, Mr. Shifty, Buster Drew, Francois, Fanar, Fenrir Lives, Silvar, Xenogears, Olo Shadow, Guko, Jordan Laughlin, Jordan Miller, Hayden Hudson, Rocket Man, Jay Hewen, Azure Midsummer, Destrega, Tepid Tag Tournament, F, James Adair, Sable Dragon Rook, Cameron himself, Einel Hander, Kelly Slaughter, Zeta, Caleb the Wanderer, Nicholas Esposito, Stephen Clancy, Cat Poop Nachos, Chew, Believe in the Net, Isaac Hampton, Ben Augusto, Beta Zeta, NVTF, Worston Show, Akurio, Kenny Mitchell, Maginact. Okay, we're getting dangerously close to that line where it's not going to be possible anymore. I'm going to keep doing it. It's the first time I've had to do 3 takes, but anyway, thank you all very much for your support. It is greatly appreciated. And regardless of your lordly status, thank you right there at the computer, TV, or your phone, or whatever, when you're listening on your iPod Nano. Thank you for watching. Until I see you next time, stay healthy, wealthy, and wise.